There's a discovery Carl Jung made almost a century ago. A discovery so profoundly disturbing, it completely reshaped his view of the human mind. And here's what few know. Andrew Huberman has corroborated this discovery, but he never talks about it publicly. Why? The answer will keep you up tonight. Imagine discovering your mind isn't truly yours, that something operates within your head, making decisions for you, something you never realized was there. Jung stumbled upon this while treating a patient who spoke languages she'd never learned, ancient languages, perfectly. She wasn't faking. Neurological tests confirmed it. Something inside her knew things she couldn't possibly know. And in that moment, Jung realized something terrifying. We aren't one person, we are many. But before I tell you what Huberman discovered, let me ask you a question. Have you ever had that strange feeling of being watched, even when alone? And like a silent presence inside your own head, that feeling has a name and a scientific explanation. Jung called them autonomous complexes. They're like separate personalities living within the same mind, each with its own memories, its own reactions, its own secrets. And here's the part no one tells you. They're active right now, as you listen to these words, watching, analyzing, deciding whether you should continue paying attention or stop listening. But Jung was just a psychologist, a man observing strange patterns in his patients. He had no way to prove this actually existed. He didn't have the technology to look inside the brain. 80 years later, Andrew Huberman does. In 2019, Huberman was studying something called the default mode network. It's a network of neurons that's active when you're not thinking about anything specific, when you're daydreaming, when you're on autopilot. And that's when he discovered something that chilled him to the bone. This network isn't one thing. It's many networks, many voices, many presences operating independently within the same brain, exactly as Jung had described. But here's the problem. Huberman never connects these dots publicly. He talks about the default mode network. He talks about altered states of consciousness, but he never mentions Jung, never mentions autonomous complexes. Why not? Because the truth is too dangerous. I'll explain why, but first, you need to understand what's really happening in your head at this very moment. There's a voice in your mind commenting on everything I say, agreeing or disagreeing, analyzing if it makes sense, deciding whether you should trust me or not. That voice isn't you. It's an autonomous complex, a separate entity living within your consciousness. Jung discovered these entities can have different ages, different personalities, even different genders from the host person, and they never sleep. Huberman confirms this when he studies brain activity patterns during sleep. The default mode network remains active. It continues processing. It continues making decisions, even when you're completely unconscious. It's like there's a second person inside you who never stops working, but it gets even stranger. Jung discovered these complexes can have memories the conscious person doesn't have. They can know things the person never learned. They can react to situations in ways the main personality would never react. And Huberman has proven this scientifically. In his studies on neuroplasticity, he discovered that different parts of the brain can form independent memories. They can learn separate patterns. They can develop automatic responses that the conscious mind never authorized. It's like you have tenants living in your head, and they're redecorating the house without asking permission. But here's the most disturbing part. Jung discovered these complexes can communicate with each other. They can make deals, they can conspire, and you never know it's happening. Remember the last time you made an important decision and then wondered why on earth you did that? As if it wasn't really you who decided. It wasn't. It was an autonomous complex temporarily taking control of your conscious mind. Jung called this psychological possession, the rational mind being hijacked by an independent psychic entity. Huberman has another name for it. He calls it states of low prefrontal cortex activity, moments where the logical part of the brain temporarily goes offline and other neural networks take over. It's the same thing Jung described, but with more palatable words for the scientific community. Now you're wondering, why doesn't Huberman talk about this openly? Why does he avoid mentioning Jung? Why does he never directly connect these dots? The answer is political and financial. If Huberman publicly admitted that Jung was right, that we are truly multiple entities living in the same body, it would change everything. It would change how we view personal responsibility. It would change how we view free will. It would change how we view the very nature of human identity, and that would scare a lot of people. Imagine going to court and the defense attorney arguing that their client can't be held responsible for a crime because it was an autonomous complex that committed it, not the main personality. Imagine discovering that all your important life decisions were influenced by psychic entities you didn't even know existed. Imagine realizing that your personality, what you call you, is just one of many voices competing for control of your mind. It's too scary to be discussed openly. But Jung wasn't afraid. He delved deep into this discovery, and what he found was even more disturbing. He discovered that these complexes aren't random. They have specific purposes. Some exist to protect you, others to punish you, some to motivate you, others to sabotage you. And each of them sincerely believes it's doing what's best for you. It's like having a committee of people living in your head, all with different opinions on how you should live your life, and all fighting for the right to speak through your mouth. Huberman confirms this when he studies the conflicts between different neural networks. He literally observes different parts of the brain competing for control of decisions, like politicians debating in a meeting. But here's what's even more bizarre. Jung discovered that you can actually talk to these complexes. You can negotiate with them. You can even make deals. He developed a technique called active imagination, a way to directly dialogue with these inner entities, to understand what they wanted, why they were acting a certain way, and the results were astounding. Patients suffering from depression discovered that there was an entity within them that was trying to protect them from further suffering, keeping them isolated, keeping them safe. Patients with anxiety discovered that there was a hypervigilant entity, constantly scanning for threats, trying to keep them alive. Every psychological symptom had an entity behind it. Every behavioral pattern had an internal explanation. And when people learned to talk to these entities, the symptoms began to disappear. Huberman observes something similar when he studies meditation and mindfulness. He notes that people who develop metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe their own thoughts, begin to notice these different inner voices. And when that happens, they gain more control over their lives. It's like consciousness is a conductor trying to coordinate an orchestra of rebellious musicians. When you don't know the musicians are there, they play what they want. But when you learn to listen to them, you can begin to conduct the music. But there's a problem that neither Jung nor Huberman openly discuss. What if these autonomous complexes aren't just products of your mind? What if there's something more? Jung suspected this. In his private writings, he suggested that some complexes seemed to possess knowledge that transcended individual experience, as if they were external entities that somehow attach themselves to the human psyche. He never published these theories. They were too radical, too dangerous. But Huberman has found evidence that supports this possibility. In his studies on psychedelics and altered states of consciousness, he observed that people consistently report contact with independent entities, beings that seem to have their own agendas, their own personalities, their own knowledge, and these entities often resemble the autonomous complexes that Jung described. The difference is that Jung found these entities in the psyches of normal people. Huberman finds them only when people are in altered states of consciousness. But what if the difference isn't about the state of consciousness? What if it's about the ability to perceive what has always been there? What if these autonomous complexes are actually independent entities that coexist with us, that live inside our minds like tenants who never signed a lease? This possibility changes everything, because if it's true, then we are never truly alone. There's always someone or something watching, listening, influencing, and maybe, just maybe, that's why Huberman never talks about Jung publicly. Because connecting these dots would lead to questions that science isn't ready to answer yet. Questions about the nature of consciousness, about the limits of individuality, about what it truly means to be human. But there's something even deeper here. Something that Jung discovered and that Huberman indirectly confirms every day. These autonomous complexes, they aren't just passive observers of your life. They are active participants. They influence your emotions, your decisions, your relationships, and they have their own agenda. Jung discovered that different complexes can have conflicting goals. One might want you to succeed. Another might want you to fail. One might want you to get close to people. Another might want you to isolate yourself. It's like having a board of directors in your head, and they never agree on anything. Huberman observes this when he studies internal neural conflicts. He literally sees different parts of the brain pulling the person in opposite directions, as if there's a civil war going on inside the mind. And most people never realize this war is happening. They just feel the effects, the indecision, the self-sabotage, the feeling of fighting against yourself. But when you understand that there's an autonomous complex working against your conscious goals, everything starts to make sense. That voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that's an autonomous complex. That inexplicable compulsion to procrastinate when you have something important to do, that's an autonomous complex. That tendency to sabotage yourself when things are going too well, that's an autonomous complex. And they're not doing it to hurt you. They sincerely believe they're protecting you from something worse. The complex that makes you procrastinate might be trying to protect you from the fear of failure. The complex that sabotages you might be trying to protect you from the pain of losing something important. Every self-destructive behavior has a protective intention behind it. Jung understood this, and he developed ways to negotiate with these complexes, to understand their concerns, to find alternative ways to get the protection they were trying to offer. And when that happened, the self-destructive behaviors simply disappeared. Huberman confirms this when he studies neuroplasticity and behavioral change. He observes that the most lasting changes happen when people can understand the adaptive function behind the behaviors they want to change. When you understand that your brain is doing something for a specific reason, you can work with it to find a better solution. That's exactly what Jung did with autonomous complexes. But here's where things get really interesting. Jung discovered that some autonomous complexes possessed knowledge that the conscious person didn't have. They could solve problems that the rational mind couldn't solve. They could have insights that transcended the person's formal education. It was as if there were other intelligences operating within the same mind. Huberman finds evidence of this when he studies insight and creativity. He observes that the best solutions often emerge from neural networks that operate below the threshold of consciousness, as if there's a parallel intelligence processing information independently. It's a phenomenon you've experienced yourself. You're trying to solve a complex problem. You struggle with it for hours. You get frustrated. You give up. And then, out of nowhere, the solution appears in your mind as if someone whispered the answer in your ear. Who whispered it? Jung would say it was an autonomous complex, an internal entity working on the problem independently of your conscious mind. Huberman would say it was neural networks operating in parallel, processing information at a subconscious level. Two different explanations for the same phenomenon, but there's a crucial difference between these two perspectives. Jung believed you could develop a conscious relationship with these complexes. You could learn to access their wisdom deliberately. Huberman focuses more on optimizing the conditions for these subconscious processes to work better. Adequate sleep, exercise, meditation, altered states of consciousness. Both work, but Jung's approach is more personal, because when you learn to converse with your autonomous complexes, you discover things about yourself you never knew existed. You uncover fears you never admitted to having, desires you never dared to acknowledge, wisdom you never knew you possessed. It's like discovering you have neighbors who've lived in your house for years, and they have fascinating stories to tell, but there's a dark side to all this. Jung also discovered that some autonomous complexes can be hostile. He encountered internal entities that seemed to revel in the person's suffering, that deliberately sabotaged any attempt at happiness or success, that seemed to have their own agenda that didn't include the well-being of the host. Jung called these entities shadow complexes, and they were the most dangerous because they were the hardest to detect. They operated on the fringes of consciousness, influencing thoughts and behaviors in subtle ways, whispering doubts, planting fears, creating self-sabotage, and the person never realized they were being manipulated. Huberman observes something similar when he studies depression and anxiety. He sees neural patterns that seem to perpetuate themselves regardless of external circumstances, as if the brain had developed a self-destructive program running in the background, a program the conscious person didn't authorize, and that frequently works against their best interests. It's exactly what Jung described as shadow complexes. And here's the most frightening part. Jung discovered that these shadow complexes can strengthen over time. They can become more sophisticated, more influential, more autonomous, as if they were psychological parasites that grow by feeding on the person's vital energy. Huberman doesn't use that language, but he observes similar patterns when he studies addictions and compulsive behaviors. He sees neural networks that become progressively more dominant, that hijack more and more brain resources, that assume more and more control over the person's behavior. It's as if they were internal entities that are gradually taking over the host mind. And when that happens, the person begins to feel like they're no longer the masters of their own lives, because in a way, they're not anymore. Now you're starting to understand why Huberman doesn't talk about this publicly, why he avoids connecting his studies with Jung's discoveries, because admitting that we can be literally possessed by internal psychic entities, that our minds can be hijacked by programs we didn't authorize, that would fundamentally change how we view personal responsibility. If you're not really in control of your decisions, if there are other entities influencing your thoughts and behaviors, then who is really responsible for your actions? It's a question our society isn't ready to answer, but Jung wasn't afraid of that question. he delved deep into the exploration of these autonomous complexes, and what he discovered was both terrifying and liberating. He discovered that, although we can be influenced by these internal entities, we are not completely powerless against them. There is a way to regain control, but it requires something that most people are unwilling to do. It requires you to accept a truth that goes against everything you've been taught about who you are. It requires you to abandon the illusion that you are a single, integrated person. It requires you to acknowledge that you are, in fact, a confederation of internal entities competing for control. And once you accept that truth, you can begin to work with them instead of against them. Jung called this individuation the process of becoming conscious of all aspects of your psyche, including those you'd rather ignore. Huberman has a different name. For it, he calls it metacognition, the ability to observe your own mental processes, to become aware of the automatic patterns that govern your behavior. It's the same thing, different words for the same transformative process. But here's where it gets interesting. Jung discovered that you can't simply fight these autonomous complexes. You can't try to eliminate or suppress them because they're smarter than you think. They know how to hide, how to operate on the fringes of your consciousness, how to influence your thoughts without you noticing. Trying to fight them is like trying to fight your own shadow. The more you fight, the stronger it gets. Huberman confirms this when he studies thought suppression. He observes that trying not to think about something only strengthens the neural networks associated with that thought. It's the white bear effect. The more you try not to think about the white bear, the more you think about it. Autonomous complexes work the same way. The more you try to ignore them, the more influential they become. So what's the solution? Jung discovered something revolutionary. Instead of fighting these complexes, you need to learn to negotiate with them. You need to understand what they want, why they're doing what they do, what need they're trying to meet, and then you need to find a way to meet that need in a way that doesn't sabotage your conscious life. It's like conducting internal diplomacy, like being a mediator between different factions of your own mind. But how exactly do you do that? Jung developed a specific technique, and Huberman, without mentioning Jung, confirms that this technique works through his research on neuroplasticity. The technique is called active imagination, and it's one of the most important discoveries in psychology that almost nobody knows about. It works like this. You enter a meditative state, not completely relaxed, but not completely alert either. Jung called this the crepuscular state of consciousness. It's the state between being awake and asleep. Huberman explores this same state when researching creativity and insight. He's discovered that it's in this specific state of consciousness that the default mode network becomes more active. This is when autonomous complexes become more accessible. In this state, you allow spontaneous images to arise in your mind. You don't try to control them. You don't try to direct them. You simply observe what emerges, and then you interact with these images as if they were real people. Sounds crazy. Jung thought he might be going insane when he first started doing this, but the results were undeniable. The autonomous complexes began to reveal themselves. They began to speak. They began to explain their motivations, and once Jung understood what they wanted, he could begin to work with them. Huberman observed something similar when studying altered states of consciousness induced by psychedelics. People consistently report conversations with inner entities, entities that offer insights, that explain behavioral patterns, that suggest solutions to psychological problems. The difference is that Jung could access these entities without substances, simply through active imagination, and he taught this technique to his patients. The results were extraordinary. One woman suffering from chronic depression discovered an autonomous complex she visualized as a sad child hidden in a dark basement. When she asked the child why it was sad, the child explained it was trying to protect her from further disappointments by keeping her isolated from the world. Through dialogue with this inner child, the woman was able to negotiate a new form of protection, a form that didn't require total isolation, and the depression began to dissipate. A man struggling with addiction discovered a complex he visualized as a ferocious guardian at the door of his mind. The guardian explained it was trying to protect him from emotional pain through chemical anesthesia. When the man was able to show the guardian alternative ways of dealing with emotional pain, the addiction lost its compulsive force. Case after case, Jung observed the same pattern. When people learned to dialogue with their autonomous complexes, psychological symptoms began to disappear naturally. Huberman confirms these results when studying therapies that focus on self-compassion and acceptance. He observes that approaches that work with the symptoms instead of against them tend to be more effective in the long run. That's exactly what Jung was doing, working with the complexes instead of against them. But there's an even deeper aspect to Jung's discovery, something he called the transcendent function. He discovered that when you can establish a conscious dialogue between different autonomous complexes, something extraordinary happens. A new perspective emerges, a perspective that transcends internal conflicts. It's as if a third voice appears, a voice that can see beyond the limitations of both the conscious mind and the individual complexes. Jung believed this was the true voice of the self, the integrated totality of the psyche. The person you could become if you could harmonize all the different facets of your mind. Huberman finds neurological evidence for this when studying flow states and transcendent experiences. He observes unique patterns of brain activity where different neural networks begin to synchronize, as if different musicians in an orchestra finally find a common rhythm. And when this happens, people report a sense of wholeness, of completeness, of finally being home within their own mind. It's the individuation that Jung described, the process of becoming who you truly are through the conscious integration of all aspects of your psyche. But here's what's really fascinating. Jung discovered that this process doesn't just happen at the individual level. He observed similar patterns in entire cultures. He began to suspect that there are collective autonomous complexes, psychic entities that influence entire groups of people, that shape social movements, that direct the course of history. Jung called this the collective unconscious, and he believed it was populated by archetypes, universal patterns of behavior that transcend individual cultures. Huberman finds evidence for this when studying mirror neurons and emotional contagion. He observes that emotions and behaviors can spread through entire populations following specific neurological patterns, as if there are neural networks that extend beyond individual brains, connecting minds through mechanisms we don't yet fully understand. It's a radical idea, the idea that our individuality may be in part an illusion, that we are all part of a larger collective mind that operates through archetypal complexes. And if this is true, then the implications are monumental. It means that the problems you face in your personal life may be connected to patterns that extend far beyond you. That your inner struggles may be reflections of collective conflicts happening on a much larger scale. Jung observed this when studying political and religious movements. He saw how specific archetypes could possess entire populations, how collective complexes could direct the behavior of millions of people simultaneously, and he saw how these collective possessions could lead to both extraordinary creativity and mass destruction. Huberman doesn't talk about this directly, But his research on social influence and mirror neurons suggests mechanisms through which this could happen. When you understand that your individual mind is connected to larger networks of psychic influence, you begin to realize that individuation is not just a personal process, it's also an act of collective responsibility. When you become aware of your own autonomous complexes, you become less susceptible to possession by collective complexes. You become more resistant to mass emotional manipulation. That's why Jung considered individuation not just a process of personal healing, but an act of service to humanity. And perhaps that's why Huberman, even confirming Jung's discoveries through his research, hesitates to connect these dots publicly. Because recognizing the reality of autonomous complexes and collective archetypes would fundamentally change how we view issues of individual responsibility and social influence. It would change how we view politics, how we view media, how we view education, how we view therapy. It would be a revolution in the understanding of human nature. But there's something even deeper here. Something Jung discovered in his later years, something he called synchronicity. He began to notice that as people underwent individuation, a process of psychological integration, strange things started happening in their lives. Meaningful coincidences, improbable encounters, opportunities that arose at the precise moment they were needed. It was as if the external universe began responding to the internal processes of psychic integration. Jung suspected this wasn't coincidence. He believed there was a profound connection between the individual psyche and the fabric of reality itself, that when you harmonized your inner complexes, you also harmonized with larger forces operating in the universe. Huberman finds clues to this when he studies altered states of consciousness and mystical experiences. He observes that people undergoing profound psychological transformations frequently report corresponding shifts in their external circumstances, as if external reality were, somehow, a reflection of internal reality. It's an idea that goes beyond conventional neuroscience. It suggests that consciousness and reality might be interconnected in ways we don't yet understand. And perhaps that's what truly unsettles people about Jung's discoveries, not just the idea that we are multiple entities inhabiting the same body, but the idea that our inner lives might be connected to the fundamental structure of reality itself. That when we change internally, the world around us changes too. It's a huge responsibility and an extraordinary opportunity. Because if Jung was right, then each person undergoing individuation isn't just healing themselves. They're contributing to the collective healing of humanity. They're helping resolve conflicts that extend far beyond their personal experience. They're participating in the evolution of human consciousness. And perhaps that's what Huberman has truly corroborated, even without explicitly saying so. That we have the power to transform not only our own lives, but the reality around us through conscious work with the autonomous complexes that live within us. The question is, are you ready to accept this responsibility? Are you ready to discover who really resides within your mind? Are you ready to become the conductor of the internal orchestra that has been playing the soundtrack of your life? Because once you accept that you're not alone inside your own head, everything changes. You stop fighting against yourself and start working with yourself. You stop feeling like a victim of your own thoughts and start feeling like a collaborator in the project of your own life. You stop seeking external solutions to internal problems and start finding allies where you once saw only enemies. And maybe, just maybe, you discover that the person you've always wanted to become was there all along, just waiting for you to stop fighting long enough to listen to what she had to say. Autonomous complexes aren't your enemies. They're your uninvited advisors, your unsolicited protectors, your unrecognized collaborators. And when you learn to work with them instead of against them, You discover a power you never knew you possessed, the power to live a conscious life, an integrated life. A life truly your own. That's what Jung discovered, that's what Huberman confirmed, and that's what they don't want you to know, because a truly individuated person is a truly free person. And free people are dangerous to systems that depend on control, hence the silence, hence the omission, hence the hesitation to connect the dots. But now you know, and knowledge is responsibility. The question is, what are you going to do with this information? Will you continue living as if you were a single entity fighting against mysterious forces? Or will you begin living as a conscious confederation of different aspects working together towards a common goal? The choice is yours. It always was. The difference is that now you know there's a choice to be made, and maybe that's all you needed to know.